we have to have a long-term perspective. Changing the world is not going to happen in a quarter. Changing the world and really manifesting a more conscious version of capitalism where these kinds of responsible practices are the norm and not the exception, it's going to take many years. We are on a journey. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and there will be others who will stand on our shoulders when we retire. It's going to take time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of The Conscious Capitalists with myself, Timothy Henry, and my partner, making the world a better place through business, Raj Sisodia. Hey there, Raj.
Hey, Timothy, congratulations on your daughter's marriage. The proud father of the bride. What an exciting time.
It was. And as I said, I didn't cry. I had allergies. It was just allergy season in the
It's good to
DC
cry.
area.
It's good to cry. So
Yeah,
what else?
It
Allergies.
was good. Very emotional, very positive, and I still have the afterglow. So thank you, Raj. Today, we have the honor of Paul Rice joining us from Fairtrade, a fellow traveler, been involved in some of the early episodes around conscious capitalism, our CEO Summit, speaking and supporting us. Now, Paul is the founder of Fairtrade USA, and he's really considered a pioneering figure in the practice of conscious capitalism and supporting our movement. He's been named Ethical Corporation's 2019 Business Leader of the Year and Social Capitalist of the Year by Fast Company magazine. He's also named an Outstanding Social Entrepreneur by the World Economic Forum, and he lives in lovely Berkeley, California. And coming out on April 8th, 2025, Every Purchase Matters, his new book, How Fair Trade Farmers, Companies, and Consumers Are Changing the World. It will be on everybody's must-read book because really every purchase does matter. Paul, welcome to our show.
Oh, thank you so much, Timothy. Great to see you. Great to see you, Raj.
Great to see you as well, Paul.
Well, you founded, you're really the father and birthing of the fair trade movement in so many ways. So maybe begin with just the definition of what does fair trade mean and what does fair trade certification mean?
Fair trade is both a philosophy and it's also a standard. Philosophically speaking, fair trade is about helping small family farmers around the world get a better price for their coffee, their bananas, their tea. And through that more equitable market transaction, have the resources to invest in their communities and improve their lives, right? So it's an approach to international development that some characterized as trade, not aid. Yeah, the early fair trade pioneers talked about trade, not aid, and that farmers around the world don't need our charity. They just need a fair price for all their hard work. So philosophically speaking, that's the way I would describe fair trade. And fair trade is also a standard. So we're all familiar with organics or non-GMO. Fair trade, similarly, is a rigorous 200-point checklist of social, environmental, and labor criteria. And when farms and factories meet those criteria and pass their annual audit, because we're also auditors, then they can proudly wear the Fair Trade Certified seal on their products. And our market partners, great companies like Whole Foods, are paying a premium back to those communities, rewarding them for their sustainable practices. So when you see that Fair Trade Certified label on coffee or granola or a shirt, you know that those farmers and those workers got a better deal.
Wow, I love that. And well, the name of the book is Every Purchase Matters. So clearly part of the issue is raising the consciousness and awareness of consumers around, do they understand what they're buying when they're buying something? So maybe say a little bit about where you see that movement moving in terms of conscious consumerism and consumers raising their awareness and be willing to match their behavior with what they say is important.
Yeah, the consumer clearly is at the heart of this what I would characterize as a macro trend of businesses moving towards more responsible, ethical, conscious practices. Certainly, business leaders have stepped up in the conscious capitalism movement and kind of led the way in many cases because they felt like conscious practices, whether that was in their global supply chain or in-house with the way employees were treated. Um, Many business leaders have just engaged in those practices because they felt like it was the right thing to do. It was a values-based choice. And certainly in the conscious capitalism movement, there are so many enlightened business leaders who do the right thing because they believe in it. But I would argue that the consumer is rewarding us for those conscious practices. And so the consumer, whether pulling conscious practices through or rewarding them once they're done, if you will, uh, the consumer is in many ways the key to the success of our movement. And in fair trade, I mean, the data is clear that consumers are increasingly reading the label. They're increasingly scrutinizing the attributes of a product. Is it healthy? Is it safe? And what's the environmental and social impact, right? And so more and more consumers, and when we look at the trend line over the last 10, 20, 30 years, this movement, I dare say it is a movement of conscious consumerism, is quite clear that consumers are increasingly rewarding companies who practice uh, socially and environmentally responsible practices, who are offering us sustainable products.
So, Paul, there was and I think there is a movement of its own called Lifestyles of Health and Sustainability, LOHAS.
Yes.
I remember seeing their conferences some years ago. I haven't heard much lately, but I know it was a growing segment of the population, which are basically people who are making their purchases with a broader lens, right? Not only towards their own health, but also looking at the well-being of people in the supply chain. Is that still a growing proportion of people out there? Is that people that you're trying to expand that population?
Yeah, absolutely, Raj. And we look at the data in the book. Every Purchase Matters. We look at a lot of different studies. The LOHAS group being one of them that are looking at um, this consumer segment that you might say is voting with its dollars for what it believes in, right? Either socially or environmentally, and that group today, depending on whose research you believe, is anywhere from a third to two-thirds of American consumers who say they are shopping on either a regular or occasional basis for products that they perceive as being more responsible and sustainable. And I don't have a whole lot of faith in purchase intent data because purchase intent data for a long time has said, 80 to 90% of consumers say, yeah, they would prefer a sustainable product. So let's look at actual purchase data, right? Let's look at the number of products in the market today versus 5, 10 years ago that have sustainable attributes. And let's also look at the market performance of companies that are leaning towards sustainability. And there, the evidence is clear. The market is increasingly moving in this direction. Companies are and products are.
Yeah, so I think that's a big piece of this whole movement, right? Is educating people to move towards conscious consumption. Otherwise we just become mindless and we look for the lowest price. And I remember when I wrote this story about this company called Jaipur Rugs in our book, The Healing Organization. And these are carpets made by women, mostly who come from the weaver community, which is considered an untouchable, caste in India. So you can imagine what their lives are like. And and then they are paid terribly and they're abused by the supply, the contractors who get these carpets made. So their lives are hell. This company exists to elevate their existence, right? To treat them with respect and dignity, to pay them well, to allow them to grow and to educate their children and so forth. So, and one of the things that they do is that we not only want to heal our weavers, but we want to heal our customers as well. And the way they do that is they put a QR code on the back of every carpet. And when the customer, scans that, they get a video of the family that actually made that carpet, and they get to see the impact of that purchase on the lives of real people, you know. So I think, and then every time you look at that carpet or you walk on it, you have that emotional connection, right? So I think that is part of what we're trying to do here, is not just mindless, you know, get as much as I can for as little as I can and disregard what the upstream consequences are, right?
I love the way you frame that, Raj. You know, this is in a way connected to the mindfulness movement, isn't it? Because normally when we're in the supermarket, I mean, the data shows that on average, consumers spend only 7 seconds in the coffee aisle grabbing the package of coffee on their way to the next aisle and the rest of their shopping. And so, how do we turn that act of purchase into an act of mindfulness where we're actually, as we're rolling down the coffee aisle of the grocery store, thinking about the family inside the package, right? Thinking about the social and environmental impact of our purchasing decisions. And, we're in a hurry when we're at the grocery store. So to your point, storytelling is key, isn't it? If every product had a QR code, if every, let's say, sustainable or ethically sourced product had a QR code that made it easy for us, probably not in the store, but once we got home, to scan the package and visit the family that we helped through our purchase. Wow, what a powerful push that could give to the ethical consumption, to the conscious consumer movement. That's something actually that Fair Trade USA is working on. With our market partners, we're working on creating that traceability and that storytelling ability back to the farmer and the worker through QR codes on the package.
Well, it's interesting. I use an app called Yuka, and Yuka allows me to go to read the barcode of the product, and it gives me a score. And it scores it on practice, it scores it on content. And it's really begun to influence my purchasing, even on something like oat milk, which, you think, oh, all these oat milk guys are great. Well, not so great when you actually look at what some of the products are and that kind of thing. So increasingly, we're asking consumers to make an extra step somewhere, right? We're asking you to either scan the QR code for the story, or we're asking you to look at the barcode and get a score in some way, shape, or form. So you're an informed purchase. But I want to flip to the other side for a second and say, what is the story that you use, or how do you try to convince our large consumer product companies that this is in their interest to move in this direction? Because, really they dominate the grocery aisles in so many ways. Um, so I'm curious, what's your approach to getting some of those bigger players to play in this space?
Yeah, it's a great question and something that I've been thinking a lot about for the better part of 35 years.
I thought you might have an idea or some thoughts on this. I don't know why, but
Before I answer that, though, I happen to be drinking just iced tea this morning, and you can see the organic label and the fair trade label on the front. And I think labels, certification labels, are kind of a shorthand for consumers. I think they're very useful as a front of pack signal, quick signal to a consumer. Oh, that thing's organic. Good to go. I care about that. That's what I'm going to buy. Or that's fair trade. Good to go. But then you can see this brand, Just Iced Tea, also has a QR code on the back. And so probably not in the store, but when you get home, and I'd love to ask them actually what percentage of their consumers are using this. Probably a smaller percentage, but those are going to be your brand evangelists, right? Go home, you can scan the code and see more about the brand and the impact. And so I think that's the future of brand engagement, leveraging technology, leveraging supply chain transparency to bring the story to the consumer, the way you suggested, Raj, with the rug example. I think that is going to boost the conscious consumer movement. So back to your question, Timothy, how do we pitch companies? How do we entice companies to apply the principles of conscious capitalism to their global supply chains? Um, the short answer is we appeal to enlightened self-interest. I spent 11 years working with farmers in the mountains of Nicaragua. That was my first career, if you will, before coming back to the U.S. and starting Fair Trade USA in 1998. And I early on pitched companies on doing fair trade because it was the right thing to do, because I had lived that reality and I saw the impact of fair trade and better prices and a more ethical approach to global trade in terms of the lives of farmers. But companies can't afford to do the right thing if it hurts their business. So we had to really think through how to engineer a model of fair trade that was win-win. Win-win-win, right? A win for the farmer, a win for the company, and a win for the consumer. Michael Porter at Harvard, wrote a lot about this notion of shared value. I know you all are very familiar with the notion of shared value, which is we create value which is shared by stakeholders, as opposed to a redistributive approach where we say to, let's say Whole Foods, hey, Whole Foods, take a hit on your margins in order to pay your farmers a better price. That's not the premise. The premise of fair trade and other expressions of ethical sourcing is this approach will create value in a way that everyone wins. And so in particular, in the case of fair trade, we've observed kind of three important benefits for the companies that participate. Number one, it's a way to mitigate reputational risk, because every developing world farmer and worker has a cell phone now. So there are no more secrets in the global supply chain. If a factory collapses, everyone's going to know about it. If there's child labor in your supply chain, sooner or later, it's going to surface. And so one way that companies are mitigating reputational risk is by developing more transparent and traceable supply chains through fair trade or other tools, in order to know and ensure that bad practices are not happening in the supply chain. Number one. Number two, a more secure supply chain that can deliver quantity and quality in a reliable way. COVID really shook up corporate America. We saw the fragility of supply chains during that time. How are companies today future proofing their supply chains and ensuring that they can access products reliably? Well, through things like fair trade, they're making a more direct connection to the supplier. They're making sure that the supplier, that farm or that factory, is getting enough money to stay in business and thrive and deliver reliably, right? So, we interviewed for. I'll just give you one quick data point because I know people love data. We interviewed the CEO of Nature Sweet. You've seen these snacking tomatoes at the grocery store. There's the fair trade certified label. We introduced them. We interviewed them last week and learned that their labor retention rates are 8 times the industry average in Mexico. In other words, their workers are staying. They're not leaving, which means their recruitment costs are down, their training of new workers costs are down, their productivity is up. So those farms are more reliable. And who do they sell to? They sell to Whole Foods. They also sell to Walmart. So Whole Foods and Walmart see in those suppliers seeing fair trade a value proposition whereby they may be paying 2 cents a pound more for those tomatoes, but those farms are becoming more reliable over the longer term. And that's important to Whole Foods, Walmart, and every company in the US. The third benefit, if you will, in this enlightened self-interest value proposition is what we were talking about, the conscious consumer. Consumers are rewarding brands and retailers who are practicing in a more responsible and sustainable way. And that's an opportunity for growth. It's an opportunity for profitability.
We always like to explore the origin stories here and the awakening moments and how people became aligned with the consciousness side of things. And your story is quite fascinating. You first went to Nicaragua at a young age. What drew you there? What caused you to go there? And what did you do in those 11 years? And then what was the turning point where you sort of pivoted towards this idea of a conscious approach to business and the idea of fair trade? So if you could just take us through that journey.
I love this question. I wish we had a couple of hours and a bottle of fair trade Nicaraguan rum to discuss it. Here. Yeah, I grew up in a family with strong social values. My grandfather was a farm worker. He picked cotton in the fields in Oklahoma. And I never knew him, but I grew up hearing those stories about hard life on the farm. And so I guess I always had a sense of empathy and sympathy with the struggles of farmers. And in college, I became a bit of an activist and also became very interested in international development and decided that after college, I wanted to go work with farmers somewhere. So in 1983, at the tender age of 22, I bought a one-way ticket to Nicaragua and I went off to work with farmers. I ended up spending 11 years working in the mountains in very remote communities with coffee farmers there, and had a chance to work on a number of projects that were very well funded by well-intentioned international aid agencies that were sending money to help farmers improve their lives. And more often than not, in my experience, those projects didn't really succeed in enabling sustainable economic development in the communities. In fact, in many cases, I think we just created dependency on foreign aid. And during that time, I would say I was a conscious anti-capitalist. I thought markets were the problem. I thought companies were the problem. I thought corporate greed was, you know, m- the reason behind the poverty that I was witnessing in rural communities. And so, my efforts were completely outside of the market and completely outside of the business community. And I had, what I am now calling my capitalist epiphany in the summer of 1990, after having worked for a number of years in Nicaragua. I was still there, and I heard very much by accident about these crazy people that called themselves fair traders. Fair trade? What's fair trade? Right? I knew what free trade was, and I had witnessed how free trade wasn't really benefiting the farmers that I was working with. What was fair trade? And the slogan of the fair traders at the time was trade, not aid. And their whole approach to global poverty was, let's just make sure farmers get a fair price for their coffee, their bananas, whatever they're growing. And that, instead of aid, will help them, in a much more sustainable way on a journey out of poverty. And I was intrigued by this notion, skeptical, but intrigued, and ended up starting Nicaragua's very first fair trade co-op. Organized 24 coffee farmers that year. We filled one container with one shipping container with, 30,000 pounds of coffee. We shipped it to a fair trade buyer called Equal Exchange based in Boston. And they paid us $1.40 a pound for our coffee. Here's the punchline: at a time when the local market price was 10 cents a pound.
Oh my God.
Ooh.
10 cents.
So after cost, we were able to deliver over $1 a pound back to the farmers, 10 times more than what they had made before or what they would have made that year. Most of these farmers had 1 or 2 acres of land. They were producing maybe 2,000 pounds a year. So you can do the math: 2,000 pounds times 10 cents. Their neighbors were making around $200 total cash income for the year, not even $1 a day. Not even $1 a day. And our folks, through this first transaction, made, over $2,000 per family. None of them had ever seen that much money before in their lives. And as a result of that income, they were able to do extraordinary things. First of all, they were able to stay on the land. There's a lot of discussion of the immigration issue right now. The reason why most people hit the road for the northern border is because they can't make ends meet where they live. If we can help families achieve a sustainable livelihood in Honduras, in Guatemala, wherever they live, they will usually stay home. That was my experience. Our farmers stayed home. They stayed on the land. They put food on the table. They kept their kids in school. They did things that sound simple, but were quite remarkable in the summer of 1990. And that was my capitalist epiphany. That is when I realized that market-based solutions could be incredibly powerful for poor people in giving them the agency and the ability to architect a journey out of poverty. I led that co-op for 4 years. We went from 24 families the first year to 3,000 families. We exported over 120 containers of coffee, millions of pounds of coffee my last year. And it was a movement. It was an enterprise, but it was also a movement of farmers who for the first time were developing the know-how and the scale and the confidence to navigate the global market in a way that didn't victimize them, in a way that allowed them to bring more resources into their communities and to develop their communities in a way that charity had never really allowed. And so that for me was the impetus, the transformative experience that led me to move back to the United States after 11 years in the field and decide to try and build the fair trade movement here in the US. Because I'd seen how it worked in the field, and I had seen that capitalism done right can actually be a force for empowerment and liberation, right? Done wrong, it can be terribly wrong, right? I mean, I used to think trickle down was bullshit. Trickle down economics didn't work in my experience until I had the fair trade and the fair trade journey, and then I realized, oh, okay, wealth creation can trickle down to farmers if they're organized, if they're plugged into the market, if they have access to the know-how in the markets to be able to, to ride that capitalist bucking bronco. It's not easy. It's not automatic. But yes, conscious capitalism is real, and it works. And fair trade is a great expression of it.
Well, I know in your book you talk about Starbucks and your experience with Starbucks, and I'd love to go back to that because there's sort of what are the lessons learned from that? That you demonstrate that clearly this is really helpful with regards to the farmers, the small farmers in particular, and yet we have somebody like a Starbucks or like a Nestle who buy tremendous amounts of coffee and really sort of dominate the market in many ways. The top 4 or 5 big coffee companies. S- So I'm curious what are the lessons learned from your experience with Starbucks? Maybe tell the story and reflect on, where does that put us today?
The short version of that answer is the lessons of Starbucks relative to the fair trade movement is the need for innovation and adaptation of any model of ethical sourcing, of any model of sustainability. For fair trade and things like it to work for farmers and workers, it has to work for business. And that necessarily, in my experience, suggests a process of co-creation to ensure the creation of shared value, to ensure that value is created for the company, right? And so, in the case of Starbucks, um, I signed Starbucks in 2001. Fair trade certification was only 3 years old. That was a big deal to get Starbucks, the market leader of the specialty coffee revolution, if you will, to join our cause in year 3 when I was still in a one-room converted warehouse office in downtown Oakland. I mean, that was a big deal. And they did this much fair trade. They didn't convert their whole supply chain. They did this much, but it sold. And so then they started to expand, and they started to expand. And by 2008, um, they had roughly 5% of all their coffee beans certified by fair trade, and that was significant volume, and it meant better income for literally thousands of farmers around the world. And at that point, I entered into a conversation of possibilities with Howard Schultz, who, is the founder and he was still the CEO at the time. And Howard is a good man. And he's also a successful entrepreneur. And he wanted to explore whether fair trade could be 100% of his business. And we knew that if Starbucks went 100% fair trade, it would change the coffee industry forever. It would change the game forever. And so Howard and his team flew down to Oakland to our office twice in 2008 and again in 2009, and we were in a conversation around how could fair trade be more relevant on a whole of business level. And essentially, the will was there, the money was there for them. I mean, they were willing to pay the fair trade premium. The missing ingredient for Starbucks was that fair trade at that time only certified small family farmers organized into cooperatives. And it was my experience from the field. If small farmers with 1 acre are standing alone, they're going to be victims of money lenders and predatory coffee buyers. But if they stand together, thousands of farmers in a associated business of one kind or another, they can create the economies of scale to transform and add value to a raw commodity and export direct and make them a much better price. So I'm a co-op guy. I used to organize co-ops. I got it. Why fair trade focused on small farmers and co-ops. However, coffee companies don't buy that way. I mean, they buy from small farmers, they buy from big estates. Yeah, and the primary attribute is for the quality of the coffee bean, and then secondly, the reliability of the delivery. And so Starbucks came to us and said, "Hey, we're interested in exploring going 100% fair trade, but you need to expand your standards in order to certify not just the small farms in the co-ops, but small farms not in co-ops and large farms." And by the way, isn't fair trade about social justice and, sustainable livelihoods? And don't you want that for the farm worker on the big farms? At that time, Timothy, we were part of the European Federation of Fair Trade Organizations, an organization that today is called Fair Trade International, and their focus was exclusively on small farmer co-ops. And so we negotiated with Europe to try and get the standard to expand. And long story short, after 2 years of negotiation, we were unsuccessful. And so Starbucks said, "Well, we love you guys, but we're going to have to do our own thing." And so Starbucks developed its own in-house approach to ethical sourcing. They got some advice from Conservation International. Walk into any Starbucks today, pick up any package, and you'll see on the side it says we're committed to ethical sourcing. And eventually they dropped fair trade altogether and went in-house, as many companies do. And their in-house program is decent. It's good. Folgers, Maxwell House, they don't do anything in terms of responsible sourcing. So you got to give props to Starbucks for doing something. It's not as high a bar as fair trade. And that was the one that got away that I write about in my book, because we missed an opportunity to change the coffee industry forever because we couldn't evolve fast enough. In the end, we ended up resigning our membership in the European Fair Trade Federation and declaring our vision of fair trade, which we call fair trade for all, which means no one gets excluded. Large farms, small farms, co-ops, non-co-ops, factories, fisheries, US based farms and factories will certify anyone and everyone who's willing to meet that high, rigorous bar of social and environmental performance. And at the time, if this was 2011, it was a bit of a controversy that we stepped out of the fair trade movement. We were attacked by some for splitting the movement. But we had luminaries like John Mackey who wrote public declarations of support for this vision of fair trade for all, a much more holistic vision for how fair trade and things like it can impact the world and be more relevant to companies.
Well, I like the way you at one point you used the word future-proof your supply chain. And when you get into that discussion, I understand a little bit more from the chocolate side. You do have this issue of keeping people on the land, in the essence that the next generation is looking and saying, "This isn't a life. I can't. I don't see a future where it's 10 cents a pound," and therefore, in order to so the young people are not coming along. And they don't come along, and start to lose some of the small farmers. Even if it's 5 or 10% of the market, you then start to lose 5 or 10% of the market. And that becomes an issue when on the pricing of coffee overall. So I guess one could argue that it's really in the long-term interest of even the big players to sort of look and say, do we have a sustainable long-term model? Because if I look out 10 years, there isn't any going to be any of these people left. Um, how do you respond to that, or what's been the response to sort of taking that kind of longer term view of reliability of my supply chain?
When I started exporting fair trade coffee out of Nicaragua in 1990, and then a decade later, when I started Fair Trade USA, I would say very little changed in that decade in terms of the mentality of corporate America with regard to sourcing. Uh, Most buyers in major retailers and brands in the U.S. were fairly indifferent to who they bought from one year to the next, as long as they could get the quality and the price and the delivery. And in fact, many brands and retailers in the US deliberately kind of played a shell game and switched suppliers every year to keep suppliers on their toes and to bust them down on price. And over the years, I've seen a dramatic shift in that mentality of corporate America with regard to the importance of the supply chain. And COVID kind of turbocharged that concern that supply chains are fragile. And if you don't take care of your supply chain, you may not have product to sell. And that puts your business at risk. And so, but even before COVID, we saw this shift toward a desire by buyers, by retailers, by brands to get greater transparency in the supply chain, to get greater traceability, and to know who their supplier was so that they could ensure that they stayed in business. I mean, in coffee, for example, here's the coffee I'm drinking today. It's Death Wish coffee. There's the fair trade label. Um, you know, these guys are in the specialty segment. This is good coffee. They rely on high quality beans. So they need to know that the high price that they're paying to an importer is trickling back down to the farmer so that that farmer can stay in business and continue to invest in quality. A farmer who's barely hanging on and struggling to feed their family, they don't care about quality. They can't afford to. So there's a shared interest there, isn't there, right? The brand needs to know the farmer is whole and thriving so that the supply will be reliable in terms of quality, in terms of volume. And so that's what I've seen over the last 20, 30 years is a real evolution in the mentality of buyers here, in corporate America toward the shared interest at heart and the importance of creating a a more of a partnership mentality with regard to the farms and the factories that they're sourcing for.
Well, one of the dangers, of course, we all face is consciousness washing or greenwashing or people over claiming what they're doing and misleading customers. Um, how big a challenge is that in the field? And do you think there's things like blockchain and other technologies that can help with that to actually get at the truth of what's happening versus what people are claiming?
Yeah, greenwashing is certainly a challenge. Although, I might argue that the fact that companies even want to greenwash, that some companies even want to do that, suggests that we're winning the battle, right? Because they could just not do anything and not give a shit and not feel any competitive pressure at all. The fact that some companies at least want to pose as sustainable suggests that the sustainability movement is growing and putting competitive pressure on them. And so, one way to look at greenwashing is it's a tiny indication that we're making progress. Now, it's not to be supported. And obviously, I'm in the certification business, fair trade certified, precisely so that I can help companies who are walking the talk separate themselves from companies that are just talking the talk, right? We have a rigorous standard. We audit performance against that standard, and you don't get to put the fair trade certified label on your product unless your suppliers met the standard. So, in that sense, I part of my core premise is we have to fight greenwashing through rigorous standards, through third party auditing, and through the trust that that standard can build with the consumer. Because, you know, at risk here is the confidence of the conscious consumer who may dismiss companies that are claiming to be responsible in their sourcing practices because there's no validation or because there's a scandal around that. So what I see is more and more companies embracing certifications of one kind or another, whether it's non-GMO or organics or fair trade or Rainforest Alliance or Marine Stewardship Council in the case of seafood, or Forest Stewardship Council in the case of wood products and paper. And I think the certification movement in general has an important role to play together with industry in um, um, essentially neutralizing the threat that greenwashing poses to the sustainability movement.
Well, I like that you raised that there's these various certification organizations and standards. But I guess if I step back, I would sort of ask, um, how is the whole greater than the sum of the parts? Because you have all of these different standards, some of which grew up in this world, some grew up in this. They've all been a little niched, but you want to lift the overall movement. What are they doing, or what are you doing? What are they doing to ensure that there is a portfolio of these things that doesn't confuse me when I go into the store and I'm looking at 4 different standards or et cetera?
It's a great question, Timothy, and you know I'll answer it in two ways. In terms of the back end and in terms of the front end. So in terms of the back end, what's behind the label, and who blesses the label, who keeps the labels honest, right? How do you know that organic certification is legit? And the answer to that is there's an international organization called ISEAL, ISEAL. Look it up, and the ISEAL standard is a standard for certifiers to essentially standardize the way all of these different organizations create standards and verify against them. So organics, Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, Marine Stewardship, Forest Stewardship, we are all members of ISEAL, and they audit us, right? So who audits the auditor? ISEAL. I may audit you, but I get audited too, right? And so that creates um, uh, a higher level of integrity and accountability and traceability across all these standards. So when someone says, I don't really believe the organic label, my answer to that is do your homework, because the organic label is rigorous and valid, not because of USDA alone, but because the organic label is also part of this global network called ISEAL. So that's kind of the back end of what all the labels, all the certifiers are doing to elevate their rigor and their credibility. On the front end, in terms of consumer perception, it is true that there's a proliferation of certification labels. And I've heard many people say that, there are too many labels and consumers are confused. I believe that's a myth. There's absolutely no evidence, there's no data suggesting that because there are more labels entering the market every year, conscious consumers are saying, I'm confused. To hell with that. I'm going to go buy an unlabeled product. You may not know what that new label is, but if you're a conscious consumer, at some point, your curiosity is going to lead you to do your research. Or you're going to assume there's a label there, must be a good thing. I mean, we have 67% consumer awareness of the Fair Trade Certified label. 67% of Americans report that they've seen this label sometime in the Fair Trade Certified label sometime in the last week. Only about 50% can give an accurate description of what it means. That's okay. That doesn't bother me, because the association of the other 17% is positive. Fair Trade Certified. Oh, okay, that must be a good thing. So yes, we're all on a journey of educating consumers about what these labels mean: Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, organics. Of course, there's a journey of education. But the evidence clearly shows that Americans are increasingly reading the label, and increasingly, whatever label it is, right? They're increasingly looking at the product to understand its value, to understand its attributes, and they're educating themselves. And more, they're choosing products that, in one way or another, reflect sustainability, right? Social, environmental, health. So I'm encouraged. I'm not bothered. Many of the companies that we work with, I'm going to show you another package here. This is Grandy Organics. This is the best granola I've ever eaten. You should try it. Okay, look at the NASCAR effect here. You've got the organic label, you've got the fair trade label, gluten free, small batch. Like, you might say, wow, that's a lot of labels. I don't know what some of that even means, but it's not hurting their sales. They're growing, right? And so I would suggest that the evidence supports the use of labels as one way to communicate to the consumer about a more sustainable or responsible product. And so I'm not worried about new labels coming in. I think it's great.
Well, I guess one of the things that I'm also in the back of my head is if I'm a big consumer product company and I'm looking at, do I want to line up with the label March? How do they think about this? And because it seems to me that ultimately this is one of those tipping point places in the supply chain. If we can get that group to start to embrace the label movement, then we have traction. Because what I've seen too often is somebody like the Grandy granola gets bought by somebody else who then takes them and puts them into their supply chain. And I'm thinking of a particular chocolate that I used to buy and got bought by one of the big chocolate companies. And lo and behold, 3 or 4 years later, I'm looking and discovering, oh my God, their practice around coffee sourcing has shifted tremendously because the big parent company said, hey, economies of scale, let's go use, let's all source one way rather than 5 ways. So I'm curious, where is that debate? Where do we stand with regards to those big consumer product companies? Anybody standing out in terms of leading the pack?
We're making progress with many of the big consumer products companies. Um, you know, it, at at Fair Trade, we started working with Nespresso a number of years ago, and together with Rainforest Alliance now, most coffee sourced by Nespresso is certified either by Rainforest or by Fair Trade. Um, Outside of fair trade, you look at Unilever and what they did with Lipton tea, and now 100% of Lipton tea is certified by Rainforest Alliance. So you see big consumer brands moving in the direction of certification. One of the things that I've observed is that big companies are sometimes constrained in terms of how they can jump into certification. It's like an aircraft carrier. It's slow to steer. And so these transitions to ethical sourcing, to certification, often take time. And so companies often, move in that direction very quietly until they've reached some kind of critical mass, and then they feel at liberty to talk about it publicly. In terms of big companies acquiring small companies, we've seen both good outcomes and not so great outcomes to that. For example, when Hershey bought Bark Thins, Bark Thins was on fire. It was a small brand. It was 100% fair trade. We had a great relationship with Bark Thins. Hershey bought them. We thought, okay, here we go. Let's see what happens. Well, Hershey has supported the brand and what it stands for. It's still 100% fair trade. And because it had the muscle and the power of a bigger company behind it, the volume has grown, and therefore the impact on farmers in Africa that produce that cocoa has grown. On the other hand, you see what happened to Honest Tea. Honest Tea was a 100% fair trade organic brand. They were acquired by Coca-Cola. And 3-4 years later, Coca-Cola shuttered the brand, killed it. And that was to the detriment of literally tens of thousands of tea farmers. Now, fortunately, Seth Goldman and his team, the founder of Honest Tea, kind of got the band back together and launched Just Iced Tea. which today is the fastest growing, bottled tea company in America. So, there's kind of a silver lining at the end of that story, but it does indicate that when big consumer product companies acquire smaller, more mission-driven brands, it can go in a good direction, or maybe not such a great direction. And so we've got our work cut out for us. And I'll just finish it on this point by saying we have to have a long-term perspective.
Mm.
Changing the world is not going to happen in a quarter. Changing the world and really manifesting a more conscious version of capitalism where these kinds of responsible practices are the norm and not the exception, it's going to take many years. We are on a journey. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and there will be others who will stand on our shoulders when we retire. It's going to take time. And that gives me both optimism and hope for our collective future, but it also gives me cause for concern because we don't have a lot of time. The planet doesn't have a lot of time. I feel a sense of urgency, and so what I wake up every day thinking about is how can we pick up the pace of change? How can we pick up the pace on making conscious capitalism the new normal? And I'm sure you all think about that every day as well. So we have a lot to talk about.
Well, Paul, this has been a very enriching and uplifting conversation, actually, for me. And your work has touched millions of lives. I mean, I don't think that's an exaggeration to say. So I'm very deeply grateful for how you have chosen to invest your life in the work that you have done. And and I think it also comes down to some individual sort of stories, moral compasses, right? I mean, you talk about Santiago, for example, right? These are some stories that you hold dear. These are some things that remind you of the real human side and consequences of what you do. So if you want to share that influence, people like, I think it's Yolanda or Santiago, and what they meant for you.
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, Raj, in all those years that I spent in the highlands of Nicaragua, I had a chance to work with um, thousands of farmers and their families, and so this as a result of that field experience, this work is very very personal for me. Uh, Being in service to farmers who were literally architecting a new future right before my eyes, right? Farmers who were coming together to pool their resources to create economies of scale with their coffee, to go direct to the international market, and to bring so much more money and resources back to their communities as a result, which they put to good use, developing their communities and improving their lives. I mean, it is to this day, 30 plus years later, deeply inspiring to me. You mentioned Santiago. Santiago Rivera is a small farmer in the mountains of Nicaragua, a fourth generation coffee farmer. And like so many of his generation, Santiago was born into poverty. He was pulled out of school after second grade to help his family in the fields. And so he learned how to read and write, but he never studied past second grade. Um, but he worked hard. And as a young man was able to buy 1 acre of coffee for himself and became his own, became a coffee farmer, but still barely able to eke out a living. And in the 80s, he joined a community co-op with 30 other families. And then in 1992, that co-op became fair trade certified. And that was when things changed dramatically for Santiago and his neighbors, because for the first time they were getting through the fair trade sales, getting a fabulous price for their coffee. And so one of the first things that they did was they built a well in their village to bring clean drinking water back to their village for the first time, right? Something that otherwise maybe they would have waited for the government to come and do for them, or they would have waited for some international, well-intentioned international aid agency to come and do for them. No, they did it for themselves, right? They had extra money from this fair trade transaction, and as a community, they discussed and decided, let's invest in clean water. As you know, the number one cause of death in children under the age of 5 in Africa, Asia, and Latin America is gastrointestinal diseases typically caused by dirty water. So you clean up the water supply, you save lives. It's that clear. They cleaned up their water supply, and they did it on their own. So of course the dividend, the invisible dividend of this was the pride and the dignity and the self-confidence of these farmers that they could solve their own problems. And the second year they created a scholarship fund. School is free, but in many countries around the world, you're not allowed to go to school if you don't have shoes on your feet. And so they created a scholarship fund so that kids could buy shoes, uniforms, and school supplies to stay in school. And so, Santiago's youngest daughter, Yolanda, who had only studied through 6th grade and then couldn't afford to keep going, she got back into school after 3 years being out of school. Thanks to the scholarship fund, $200 a year, that's all it took, $200 per year. She was able to get back into school. She went through, finished high school, top of her class. They created another scholarship, a fair trade scholarship fund for the community to go on, for kids to go on to college. She went to college. She was the first woman in the community to graduate high school. She was the first woman in the community to go to college. She studied biology. She finished her college degree, and she went back to her community. And she's there to this day. Yolanda is there serving her community, giving back. And it's just such a great story in my mind, not just of the power of fair trade, to support education, but the ability of women to transform their lives in rural communities where maybe many women can only aspire to be first a farmer's daughter and then a farmer's wife. And what we've witnessed is this incredible journey of empowerment for women around the world who are part of this different approach to supply chains, and it's incredibly inspiring to me.
Oh, very touching. I'm going to end with some rapid fire questions, Paul. Short questions and quick answers. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Looks like both. I mean, you've got a lot of products around you there. A book that changed your life.
Yours. Conscious
Oh, wow.
Capitalism.
Oh, thank you. The most inspiring conscious leader alive today.
Ooh, you put me on the spot there. I know a lot. I'm going to have to say Thich Nhat Hanh.
No, he's not alive anymore, but I will take it. Yeah, thank you.
He's
Uh,
alive in me, brother.
Ah,
One thing you miss from your days in Nicaragua.
Hanging out with farmers in their homes, eating rice and beans, and hearing stories and feeling, the incredible warmth and generosity of simple folk who work hard and just want to create a better life for their kids, just like us. I miss those days in the field.
What's a fair trade product that you can't live without?
Ooh.
Is it that granola?
I mean, I'm somewhat fickle in my fair trade coffee choices. I love so many of the fair trade coffees out there. Whole Foods has great fair trade coffee. Green Mountain. This week it's Death Wish coffee. They're all good. I love that journey of discovery, trying different fair trade coffee companies, and invariably just being blown away by the quality. And by the way, sustainable products need to be delicious and healthy too. And I'm really proud of the brands that we work with because they deliver on both fronts.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Straight out of college, summer of 1983, I told all of my friends, family, and mentors that I wanted to go to Nicaragua. And there was a revolution going on at the time. There was a war, and pretty much everyone told me, don't go. That's dumb. Don't do that. But one person He was the master of Calhoun College at Yale. He was a mentor. He was a spiritual guide for me. Davy Napier, Reverend Davy Napier. Davy said, go, you have to go. He was the only one who said, go to Nicaragua, have that experience, dive in, learn. Don't have any illusions that you're going to contribute a lot at the very beginning, but go get the experience in the field. And I did it. And it was life-changing.
For not just for you, but for millions. And finally, what gives you hope today? It feels like we're in dark times, but what gives you hope?
Honestly, what gives me hope is the resilience of the conscious capitalism movement and the resilience of conscious consumerism. The title of my book is Every Purchase Matters. And that title is it's a call to action at a time when so many consumers are wondering what they can do. When so many people are realizing that the shopping decisions that we make is a way to vote with our dollars for the kind of world we want to see. And so, I get much hope from the companies who are leaning in to responsible sourcing and sustainable products, and to the consumers that are increasingly looking for products that are consistent with their values.
I love that. I love that. Paul, thank you so much for your words of encouragement and so much for what you've done to change the face of how we think about conscious consumerism. Thank you. And thank you, of course, for joining us today.
Thank you, Timothy. Thank you, Raj. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah.
And thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed today's podcast, then please feel free to hit the subscribe button on whatever channel you're listening. And also feel free to go over to Apple and iTunes and give us a score and leave us a message. We always appreciate hearing from you. And thank you to Rainbow Productions, who make sure these things come out each week when we do it, and to our sponsor, Conscious Capitalism, Inc. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week.